Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. The ominous voice behind the screen is Justice with the Warfield Center. I'm the events coordinator. We really appreciate you all for joining us for this amazing book conversation. We'll just wait a couple of moments as we usher some more people into the chat, and we'll begin at 3:30. If you all have any questions at all, please direct them to the Q&A, and we'll also be monitoring the chat throughout the conversation as well. So feel free to utilize the chat. If you see a face that you're familiar with, say hello.
Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Wilkes, and I am director of the John L.Warfield Center for African and African American Studies. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our first faculty book talk of the 2020-2021 academic year, Dr. Cherise Smith in conversation with Valerie Cassel Oliver. This ongoing series celebrates the publication of new work by Warfield Center affiliates and features authors in conversation with visiting scholars and artists. We hope that you'll join us again on Thursday, October 15th, when Dr. Lisa B. Thompson will be discussing her work with Dr. Imani Perry, and on Thursday, November 12th, when Dr. Samantha Pinto will be discussing her new book with Dr. Jennifer Nash. For more information about these and other Warfield Center events, please look for us on the web, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can find our URL and handles in the chat. No center event would be possible without the efforts of center staff, so please join me in thanking events coordinator Justice Madden, whom you've already heard, and graduate assistants Kelsey Mason and Beth Colon Pizzini. One final but no less important matter before we meet our panelists. I would like to acknowledge that those of us joining from the US, Canada, and Mexico are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, I would like to acknowledge that the Alabama Cushada, Caddo, Carrizo Come Crudo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become part of these lands and territories in Texas. Our featured author today is Dr. Cherise Smith, Chair of African and African Diaspora Studies and Professor of African and African Diaspora Studies in Art History here at UT Austin. She specializes in American art after 1945, especially as it intersects with the politics of identity, race, and gender. Smith joined UT Austin in 2005 after finishing the PhD at Stanford University. Her research centers on African American art, the history of photography, performance, and contemporary art. Her book, Michael Ray Charles, Studies in Blackness, University of Texas Press 2020, places the artist's work in the context of the 1990s, the rise and collecting of Black memorabilia, and pop art, among other historical trends. Her book, Enacting Others, Politics of Identity in Eleanor Anton, Nikki S. Lee, Adrian Piper, and Anna DeVere Smith, examines how identity is negotiated in performance art, in which women artists take on the characteristics and manners of a racial, ethnic, and gender other. She has published essays in Art Journal, American Art, and Exposure, among other venues. Currently, Smith is executive director of the art galleries at Black Studies, where she spearheads Black Studies Art and Archive Initiative, which seeks to expand UT's holdings of art and material collections relating to people of African descent and increase its exhibition spaces. Under its auspices, she created 2 exhibition spaces, the Idea Lab and the Christian Green Gallery, and she has shepherded in donations of art by Norman Lewis, Romaire Bearden, and Charles White, among others. Smith's research has been supported by the Getty Foundation Postdoctoral Fellowship, the Ford Foundation Diversity Postdoctoral Fellowship, and a research fellowship at the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African American Research at Harvard University. She has worked in the curatorial departments of the Art Institute of Chicago, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the St. Louis Art Museum. Joining Dr. Smith in conversation is Valerie Cassel Oliver, the Sidney and Francis Lewis Family Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Prior to her position at the VMFA, Oliver was Senior Curator at the Contemporary Arts Museum, Houston, where she worked from 2000 to 2017. She has served as Director of the Visiting Artist Program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and a Program Specialist at the National Endowment for the Arts. In 2000, she was one of 6 curators selected to organize the biennial for the Whitney Museum of American Art. During her tenure at the CMH, Cassel Oliver organized numerous exhibitions, including the acclaimed Double Consciousness, Black Conceptual Art since 1970, Cinema Remixed and Reloaded, Black Women's Artists and the Moving Image since 1970, with Dr. Andrea Barnwell Brownlee, and a major retrospective on Benjamin Patterson, Born in the State of Fluxus, and Radical Presence, Black Performance in Contemporary Art. She has also mounted significant survey exhibitions for Donald Moffat, Trenton Doyle Hancock, Jenny C. Jones, Angel Otero, and Annabeth Rosen. Her 2018 debut exhibition at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts was a 50-year survey of work by Howardina Pindell entitled Howardina Pindell, What Remains to be Seen? Co-organized with Naomi Beckwith, the exhibition was named one of the most influential of the decade. Most recently, Cassel Oliver organized the exhibition Cosmologies from the Tree of Life, which featured over 30 newly acquired works from the Souls Grown Deep Foundation. She is currently developing the group exhibition, The Dirty South, Contemporary Art, Material Culture, and the Sonic Impulse, scheduled to open at the VMFA in May 2021. Cassel Oliver is the recipient of a Getty Curatorial Research Fellowship, the High Museum of Art's David C. Driscoll Award, the Arthur and Carol Kaufman Goldberg Foundation to Life Fellowship at Hunter College, and the James A. Porter Book Award from Howard University. From 2016 to 17, she was a senior fellow in curatorial studies at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and in spring 2020, she participated in UT Austin's Viewpoint series with Hamza Walker. Cassel Oliver holds an MA in art history from Howard University in Washington, D.C., and a BS in communications from the University of Texas at Austin. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cherise Smith and in welcoming back Valerie Cassel Oliver.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's wonderful to be back.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, I'm sorry, I had a hard time actually getting connected back up, but thank you, Jennifer, for the introduction. And Valerie, thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Well, thank you for the invitation. This was initially slated in the spring.
It was, and you were supposed to come and talk with me in physical space.
Exactly. But it is a joy to be here with you, and I'm really thrilled to get into this project and to talk with you just in general. We haven't had an opportunity to do that, and of course we're doing it in public, but that's okay. That's fine too. We had a little pre-conversation, so
we did. And
congratulations on your book, first and foremost.
Thank you, and all of your many successes, listeners, watchers, whatever attendees of this event will surely have seen all of the great things that are happening on Instagram at the VMFA, and I have been so interested to see how the atrium is shaping up with the Glenn Ligon, with the Odita, and you just told me today that there's also a Rashid Johnson there, which I had no idea about. So that's amazing.
It's exciting. It's truly exciting, and it brings to mind, this idea of what happens when our bodies go into places that they ordinarily do not go into. Transformative things happen when we're given the opportunity to make those calls. So, I mean, with you being there and having been there for a while, you have done transformative things at UT. I know, I used to be there as a student. So for those who are participating, UT was a very different place in the early 1980s, and how far we've come is a testament to what happens when you bring bodies into these spaces, to transform them and to expand them, to allow us to exist and be reflected in ways that are very impactful. So thank you for doing that at my old alma mater.
Yes. And we talked about how you were in the comm school, which is now grown quite a bit. You probably saw when you were here in the springtime with Viewpoint, and that the Black and Latino Studies building, the Gordon White building where I am right now, is right across the street from the Comm School. And I have to imagine that you never would have thought there would be a Black and Latino Studies building at the University of Texas.
In a million years. I mean, we were protesting the UT's investment in South Africa when I was there. And the museum, I mean, there were no spaces. I mean, the museum was the Ransom Center, and of course the Blanton, which is also, thanks to, you know, Veronica has really, and Annette before her, have really just been transformative too. But no, I mean, we did not see a lot of ourselves. In fact, we were but 1% of the population at that time. And you have to remember, Human Sweat case was only, you know, maybe, 11 years prior to my even arriving at that museum, at the museum. See my head spaces there,
Yeah.
at the university. So, you know, it really speaks volumes where we've gone. You know, when we are invited to the table and when we're given the resources and the nourishment, what truly can happen, and it doesn't detract or take away anything, it only adds, and it adds to, you know, it adds in a way that provides such a wonderfully rich conversation. So, and I can see that in this book, you know, that the University of Texas produced. No expense was spared. It is quite a beautiful book, and it's rich, you know, and I love the fact that it's also very timely, even though you're discussing Michael Ray's practice and beginning in the 1990s. So much of what we're dealing with now really comes full circle to this.
Yeah, it's kind of sad.
Yeah, I like to think of it as a spiral as opposed to a circle. And, you know, that, you know, each time we come around, we inch a little further up, you know? So there are things that we know now that we didn't know then, that enables us to get a little higher in our footing and in the conversation and the dialogue.
Yeah.
What I love is how in depth this goes. And it really is a testament to something that you and I are both engaged in, which is contemporary art and contemporary artists. And the beauty is that it is really so responsive to the moment, you know, and it is always this collaboration. You know, you do expound later in the book, but the first part is this beautiful conversation between the two of you. So I would love to know your history, because in order to get to a point where you could do projects like this, there has to be trust.
Yes.
There has to be a certain relational connection. I would say relational aesthetics, but that's not quite it. There's a simpatico sensibility that has to be arrived at in order to get the depth that you've gotten here. And so I'd love to know really the impetus of this project. You know, I mean, you both worked at UT. I think both understanding what Black bodies in the academy is like. And so I'll just turn it over with that and allow you to answer.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Valerie. I mean, I think I first came to know Michael Ray's work at the Art Institute of Chicago, where we worked together back in the late 1990s. And really admiring it, but also at that point, I was an Africanist, if you remember, working in the African department, and I was interested, but I also didn't quite know how to engage. I just thought, wow, this is really great, powerful work. But it was also in the context of and then kind of very quickly after came the context of the controversy surrounding his work and Kara Walker's work. And so then it was deeply, you know, controversial and and inflamed. I don't want to say inflammatory, but inflamed. And so it was a number of years later that I applied for the job at the University of Texas, and Michael Ray happened to be on the committee that hired me. And so that was when I first met him. Interestingly, he's a full professor at that point. I'm an assistant professor at that point. And, you know, he's doing his thing, teaching his classes, and not really at all engaged with the fact that he's got a junior colleague who's across the street in art history that he might want to mentor. And so, you know, somewhere in, I think, year number 2, I said, you know, you might want to mentor me if you want me to stay and get tenure. And he was like, oh, yes, yes.
What was the configuration of the departments at that time? I mean, what was the faculty like? I mean, in terms of just the sheer demographics.
Yeah, I mean, Valerie, you have an idea of what it was like. I mean, at that point, and the way that it still is that art is on one side of a street, art history is on the other side of a street. There's not a whole lot of interaction between those faculty, although, you know, people who work on contemporary art do more of that bridging than the people who work on historic art. When I was hired, I was one of 2 people of color in all of art history. And at that point, Michael Ray and John Yancey were the only people of color in art. So there were 4 of us, 1 Latina, in all of art and art history. Very quickly, the Latina left for another position. I was the sole person of color in art history. And that would not change until Eddie Chambers was hired a number of years later. I'm the first person to have gotten tenure the first person of color, I should say, to have gotten tenure at the University of Texas. And my position, the position that I hold, was a faculty line that was given from African and African American studies to art history precisely to kind of open up a gap. And I mean, it was auspicious. I mean, when I think about what, with a number of colleagues around campus, we have been able to achieve, you know, now we have Nicole Iway in painting, in art. In art history, we've got Moyo Okadiji, we've got Eddie Chambers, and me. And then we have 2 people in Latin American studies and Latinx. That's a completely different landscape than when I arrived 16 years ago. You know, to now have dedicated exhibition spaces, to just show the work of people of color, to have a building that is dedicated to Black and Latino studies, that is, by the way, filled with art. I mean, just outside of my door right now, we have a Daoud Bey on view. We have a Nadia Blah on view. In my office, I will just show people, I've got Arnold Kemp. I've got a Michael Ray Charles and a Hank Willis Thomas. And, you know, I didn't ever think this would be possible at the University of Texas. And it's really, bringing it back to Michael Ray, one of the first steps was that we decided together to embark on a lecture series. And, you know, you have a small budget to decide who you're going to bring to campus, who you'd like to hear from, and who you think your students and your faculty need to hear from. And to, you know, pretty easily agree on the breadth of people who came. I mean, Carla Williams came, Renee Cox came, Eddie Chambers came before he was faculty.
Adrian Piper, I believe.
Adrian Piper.
For that time, yes.
Adrian Piper, Roger Shimomura, who you just mentioned a few minutes ago. Gordon Chang, a historian of Asian American art. And so and then we also did a whole series on Jewish American art. And so to begin to see the breadth of his interest, and that we together shared this wide range of topics, was one of the first places that we began to connect. And, you know, I think that then being kind of in the trenches as kind of lone people of color in art and art history, I mean, and like I said, there were a couple of us, but not very many of us, that was also a kind of galvanizing moment as well. And, you know, I think we shared a lot on kinds of, on topics that we were each working on. And so I want to say it was probably about 10 years ago, I started working on a project on Black and other dark works of art. And so I started gathering this research and beginning to make an image archive of, you know, the Ad Reinhardts, the Rashid Johnsons, the Maleviches, and the Adam Pendletons, you know, all of that, and the Ellen Gallaghers, along with the Arnold Kemps. So all of that kind of gathered together. And, you know, I just started talking about these dark works of art. And then dark works of art started being made by my artist friend, right? And so it's been that kind of give and take. So that's a kind of a long answer to your question.
No, it's a wonderful answer. And I think it really speaks again to relationship building, and, you know, to be really truly impactful, you know, or impactful, excuse me. You know, you really have to have this sort of history behind you to kind of have that foundation, so that you can almost speak without speaking. You know, you don't want to leave things to chance, but, you know, I think that's why there is such richness here that has been offered, and that you're doing it again in concert with the artists. You know, oftentimes, you know, living artists, it's exciting. Contemporary art is exciting. You know, everybody's into contemporary art, and it's about exhibitions, but it's also about giving people foundations and platforms to be seen and to be heard and to be spoken to, and to hear themselves in response, rather than simply writing about them or writing about their practices. You're giving artists a primary access to the audiences. And so that is a gift to the artists. It's also a testament to us as curators, because that's part of what we do. Yeah, that you develop these things and you learn so much, as you say, just through these conversations. I learned so much from my artist friends as well, in terms of how to look and how to see works of art.
Yes.
How they're composed and what they come out of. But
And
there's
they
something
think so differently. I'm sorry, Valerie. They think so differently than we do.
Exactly.
As historians and as critics and as curators, we maybe think in terms of stories and maybe discourses that frame works of art and how they get made, but they're thinking about that thing was painted this way, that thing was built this way. And, you know, it's a real synthetic way that they deal with artworks and with the world. And, you know, if you can take a song from here and an image from here, and all of it kind of comes in and it gets filtered out in this way that doesn't relate to either, but was informed by, yeah, it's pretty amazing. And of course, the challenge is that, you know, working with the living artist means that the living artist talks back.
Absolutely. You know, it's good to get a good one, you know, and one that challenges you for the good, not just for the provocation of being challenging.
Yes.
And I think what's really beautiful to me, and what shows in Michael Ray's work, is the love of artistic production, the love of how paintings are made. And you learn history. You learn art history through the eyes of the artist. I mean, we learn a specific type of art history, right? But when you look at them, you look at people like, you know, Kehinde Wiley, you know, he is totally in love with classical frameworks. Michael Ray, I could see the classical in him. I could see the advertising, that lens of looking at things as commodity, you know, and how do you present commodified objects, even if they're human objects.
Yes.
You see that through the lens. So I've learned so much about advertising, you know, in looking at that work, you know, how things are comprised, positioned, composed, the colors chosen, and how you can disrupt that. Things that are familiar but unfamiliar at the same time, you know, that disruption and how to really get in there. And it enables me to also tweak my thoughts in terms of how I frame artists, to put something forward that's familiar, but also equally disruptive, you know. It's, you know, it's the exciting thing about working with living artists, truly.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that I will say about Michael is that he's really interested in art history, and you see it in the work. You see that he's, you know, leaning on and pointing to other artworks, and so he was a willing participant in the book because he understands, look, the work's got to be historicized. That is how it kind of begins to unfold. It isn't only just the kind of viewing it in person, but there's this other thing that happens when somebody begins to pick it apart and to let it unfurl.
Exactly. You know, there's sort of like, I liken the sort of musicians, the hip hop musicians, and their ability to extract elements of things. They truly are ethnomusicologists. They truly are people who study sound and study music and study the history of sounds. And I think that in the same way of artists, you know, they really do study, you know, practices, whether it's brush strokes, whether it's tone on tones, you know, the use of color, the use of line and composition. They are students of painting if they're painters. They're students of photography if they're photographers. And sometimes they bring that other dimension of something else into the work, whether it's performance or whether it's poetry or literature, that totally reshapes how they can present their practice to the world, and it adds something to the genre itself. It's really, it's truly remarkable, especially with contemporary art, because so much of it is being created. You know, we're writing history as it happens.
Yeah.
So to look back, you know, 15 years from this point, what kind of conversations we will be having is really predicated on your writing a book like this. You know, exhibitions being produced now that are reshaping the conversation.
Yeah.
And it's profound to think that we've lived in this season and in this landscape long enough to see ourselves coming back at ourselves. And I see this in Michael Ray's work, that, as you were saying, you know, being in Chicago, and we were in Chicago at the same time, which is how we met one another.
Yeah.
And it was a moment, wasn't it?
It was.
You know, I look at Michael Ray's work from that period, and I think, you know, what he was discussing and what he was talking about, it was so controversial at the moment.
Yeah.
And now it feels prescient, you know. It feels like we needed to be talking about this conversation, because once again our bodies are on the line. Once again we are being commodified, whether it's in fashion or whether it's in art, you know, where Black artists are trendy, we're in vogue, you know, so everybody's copping their whole little roster of Black artists, you know. And how do you embrace that but critique it at the same time? And I think Michael Ray was ahead of the curve in contending with that, you know?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think that if you look at Bamboozled, which is having a 20-year anniversary this year,
Wow.
and think through how Michael Ray influences Spike Lee, and then it goes back the other way where the movie influences culture. So it's, you know, going this way and then it comes back this way. But at bottom, or you know, kind of at what it all has in common is still a kind of disregard for Black people and Black bodies and Black intellects, and also a usurpation, a love for without the people themselves. And it's, you know, I think we both mentioned how challenging the current moment is, and that is one of the real challenges, that we're still having some of these same conversations that, you know, back in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, we thought we were really changing the game and changing conversations. And I think that we did, but also culture is moving at just as quickly as we're changing things and co-opting things just as quickly as they're getting changed.
But that's the beauty of it, right? Because the response of Black bodies is to be hyper-regenerative. So the minute you get to a certain point, we're creating something else, you know, and in a way, it's the beauty of being cultural producers, you know, and we are able to take culture, even sometimes falling back on culture from time, you know, from decades prior, you know, and reinventing that and bringing it back to the fore. I think that's what we're all doing in many ways, because so much of the narrative around Black creative expression has been parallel to what we see or have seen in museums and in books and what have you, but they haven't been present. So it's a lot of what I feel museums are doing now is going back to recoup those narratives.
Yeah.
And it's interesting on how a younger generation of artists are really kind of playing off of that. I think of people like Hank Willis Thomas and how he plays off the advertising from the 1970s and you know, strips away, you know, the language to show the image. And in many ways, the spaces where they are somewhat insidious, as were Currier and Ives, you know, in the 1880s, to, you know, spaces where, you know, once we can be the author of those images, how it really does shift and change things, you know. So I think there's really, there's a lot to unpack. And again, you know, we find ourselves coming back around. I think somewhat different is an awareness or a consciousness that we need to do more to sustain the conversations. So your being in the academy, my being in the museum, and that there are growing numbers of us that are transforming and shaping with the framework that the conversation has to be sustained. How do you root it? How do you make it not just, we were speaking earlier with the French-American, you know, French-American Museums Alliance, and the conversation that, you know, yes, we've been through all these movements, you know, there was the knocking of the door, you know, in the late 1960s to say, Black bodies need to be in spaces where we can author our own stories. And then having people like Howardina Pindell and Kinnison McShine, you know, come and be those, you know, Regina Perry, you know, at the VMFA before me, really come in and tell those stories and be those authors. And then, you know, then moving from there to the multicultural movement, you know, which is what I grew up in.
As did I.
Yeah, we kind of got swept up in that, you know, and that propelled us forward. That was an amazingly energizing moment to
Yeah.
be there in the 80s and know that these inroads have been made and we are able to advance in these fields and to see more people in these fields to where we are today, where we are training the next generation to really, you know, be ready as soldiers to come in our stead. You know, I like to call it, you know, the shark teeth syndrome. You know, as soon as one row goes out, another one is coming in, you know, and allowing these opportunities for us to be able to step aside and to move on to other things and allow this generation to come in and stand in. So, and I think, you know, with Michael Ray's propensity to be in the academy, to teach that next generation, you know, I think that sentiment is a shared one, you know, and I think it comes from that sense of being weathered, to being the only ones in the academy for so long. You know, Sylvia Winter writes, you know, in her book on being human as praxis, you know, we suffer so many macro and micro aggressions that we literally become weathered. And I think we're in that moment again where we're weathered, but that is precisely the time that we need to dig these roots so much deeper, where we need to produce books like this. We need to do exhibitions, you know, to continuously kind of press forward, even in this moment.
Absolutely. I mean, Valerie, one of the things that I think that the book does that I appreciate about your own practice is to think about its regionalism. And certainly Michael Ray is a national and internationally known artist, but he's also an artist who stayed in Texas and who has made a career for himself here. And now I know that you've worked with him in a couple of different instances, and with his work with Splat Boom Pow, for example. And I know that you're now doing this show on Dirty South. But you know, this is an important thing. How do we consider art that is both made in the region, but also significant to the larger national identity and national sense of belonging, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, you know, so much of not all Black bodies came up from the South, but most of them did. So let's just start with that. So I'll put out my disclaimer, you know, and talk about the South, the you know, the diaspora of the South is really the North. You know, so you really, I mean,
the North and the West, I will say,
and the West, of course, you know, because especially from Texas, people went from Texas to the West. So you see these migration patterns of who goes up to Chicago, who goes to New York, and, you know, from North Carolina to DC. And I mean, it goes on and on. You could see these through lines, but you see the South migrating upward in the North. And I just called it the diaspora, you know, because so much of who we have retained, that those traditions, and I don't want to essentialize Blackness. I don't think there is such a thing. There's no monolithic Blackness, but there are elements around our expressions, there are elements, there are traditions that we embark upon, there are practices that we engage in that really speak to the persistence of thought that we have carried within ourselves for centuries. And that's part and parcel of what the Dirty South is about. It is really looking at the South, not necessarily, and really giving it something more than, you know, oftentimes it's relegated.
Stereotyped.
And
stereotyped.
And stereotyped, it's relegated. And so it's really, I'd like to give a shout out to Southern hip hop artists who've really given us a greater sense of ourselves, right? Because, you know, in 1995, when Outkast wins, you know, the first thing Andre 3000, well, the only thing they could get off, because they're being jeered in a way, is he says, the South's got something to say, y'all. the South has got something to say. You know, and before then it was an East Coast thing, it was a West Coast thing, which is how everything is framed.
Yeah.
All the creative capital is East Coast. All the creative capital is West Coast. And it was never looked inward to the source. We are the source, you know, coming out of the South. So even though certain languages, certain cadences, certain way of pacing, a way of looking through things to create and speak of other things is so tinged with what I consider a primacy of self.
Yeah.
You know, it is time, and I think Trevor and Miranda Lash did an amazing job in Southern accents. You know, I mean, these are the types of things I feel like we are now looking back at, quote unquote, regionalism. We're now looking back at the South to say, if jazz, and this was part of the argument with cosmologies from the Tree of Life, if jazz can be said, can be considered an original American art form, why is it that the visual art practices emerging in the South are not considered, you know, original visual art forms?
Yeah.
You can't look at a quilt and say you don't see jazz. You cannot look at it and say you don't see improvisation.
Right.
There are parallels between the visual and the sonic, and that encapsulates a lot of what the Dirty South is about. It looks at that over a period of 100 years. So from 1920 to 2020, you know, so to say, you know, Michael comes out of this sense of regionalism, it's true, but there's something very that there's the primacy of the story that begins there, that gives it such a resonance, that gives it such power. The fact that we're pulling on all of the things that would have disparaged Black bodies, right? The pickaninnies, the, you know, the what did you call it? Contemptible collectibles,
Yes.
you know, the banks, the postcards, the, you know, all of the macroaggressions of what Blackness is about is somehow embraced and repositioned in a way that empowers, not diminishes. And there's a beautiful statement by Robert Colescott. And, you know, I see Michael Ray's work in tandem with history, with people like Colescott, with people like Hayden Palmer, with people like Archibald Motley, you know. But Colescott is so interesting because he comes out of the South.
Yeah.
He comes out of Louisiana, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, to Oakland.
Yeah. And I remember being at, I think it was the National Gallery. He was having an exhibit and he was speaking, and controversial also. People did not like Palmer Hayden's work. They did not like Colescott's work. They did not like Archibald Motley's work because they felt it showed the ugliness of us, right? And so one woman during the Q&A stood up and said, you know, why don't you let these stereotypes die? Why do you keep bringing them back? Why don't you just let them die? And Colescott said, and I'll never forget, he said, because I'd rather kill them.
That's great.
Yeah, he's like, I'm not going to let them die. That's gentle. I want to be as violent with them as they have been with us.
Yeah.
And I mean, and it was so on point. I was like, wow, he so nailed it.
Yes. That is absolutely nailing it. Yeah. And I think that Michael Ray does something similar with his work. I mean, one of the things that he says that I think is so clear-minded is, I am not painting Black people. I am painting someone's thought of a Black person, someone's idea or someone's representation of a Black person, but these are not Black people.
Right.
And so when someone says, why do you paint Black people like that? He says, I'm not painting Black people.
It's true. You know, it's just come up. It's a very well-worn statement, and it's just come up recently. I think D.L. Hughley made mention. He said, the most dangerous place for Black people is in the minds and the perceptions of white people.
Yeah.
That is the most dangerous place.
Yes.
Your perception of who we are rather than the authenticness of who we are.
Yes.
And given Michael Ray's, understanding of advertising, he has to know the history of advertising, how Black people have been portrayed, not just in advertising, but in culture. It is someone's perception of who we are. So why not take that perception and push it back onto people to show, oftentimes with my son, when he says things, I have to repeat what he says so that he could hear the absurdity of it.
Yes.
Now, wait a minute, let me make sure I got this straight. Are you saying blah, 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 blah? And it is to show, I think, visually the absurdity of what it is you perceive us to be, what you perceive us to look like. And then to do you a solid favor and go ahead and push it in your face, then we'll add an extra edge to it. So you won't do it anymore.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you're bringing this up because we've had to have conversations in our house about the casual use of the phrase Karen. And, on the one hand, we understand that there is a stereotypical thing that is associated with now the idea, the archetype of the Karen. But that's also stereotyping people. And you need to separate those things out. There's some bad behaviors that some people engage in, and then there are the individual people who sometimes have that name.
Right.
Yeah. They're not the same thing.
Exactly. Who are nothing like the person who is being portrayed in that video.
Right.
It's like Becky with the good hair. I mean, we do this, what's the other one? Tyrone. Oh my God. I was like, the poor people named Tyrone. It's like,
right.
I'm ready to change my name. That's the way I see it, But then there's also on the flip side of it, in terms of how one gets stereotyped, I'm thinking of something that also comes up is this notion of blackface and performativity, performing Blackness.
Yes.
But that Blackness, as it's being performed, sure, there were minstrels and they were performing what they perceived to be as Blackness. But what I find so intriguing are white women performing Blackness, the Rachel Dozers of the world. And I've forgotten the woman's name who's just recently had to step down, who portrayed herself as a woman of color.
She was at faculty at George Washington University, and I cannot remember
her name. I'm gonna have to look it up. I'm gonna look in my phone. But yes, that notion of performativity, what does it mean to perform Blackness in this moment? Oh, Jessica, someone wrote Jessica Krug.
Yeah.
So, it is this notion of, yes, Cruz, excuse me, thank you. I'm reading the chats, I'm multitasking over here. So it is this notion of what performing Blackness looks like these days.
Yeah. And also, I mean, in the context of, first off, I have felt bad for Rachel Dolezal, who is now the standard bearer of that kind of performance. Jessica Krug, no one's been using her name. They've been saying the new Rachel Dolezal. And I thought,
wow, but it's so far. Yes, exactly.
Up again.
Well, it's hard being the first. That's what happens. But we all know that there have been, I think what's interesting is like we're finally getting to this point, I think at least 20 years ago, where we were starting to understand the performativity of whiteness.
Yep.
That we started understanding, and we knew, because, certainly their family members or there's lore of Black people passing as white, So, now that it's cool to be passing as Black, I think is so, well, where have we come, We have come far.
I mean, it's interesting because Jessica Krug is actually trying to pass for pretty much every brown variety that she can. I mean, she apparently goes from Latina to African American to some other thing,
Yes.
depending on her setting. And I mean, it's absolutely about the performativity of identity and how people get to manipulate aspects of identity, whether it's hair, clothes, skin color, how you apply your makeup, what kind of, how you put clothes together.
Mm-hmm.
It's, you know, it's funny because I feel like there hasn't yet been much of a conversation about how Dolezal and Krug are quite different, in fact. And that Dolezal is assuming it not in a kind of public way and trying to talk over everyone about her Blackness. She's trying to live her life and kind of do good work. Krug, on the other hand, is being very emotive and public about her taking on of these other identities. And I'm curious about that. I'm curious.
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, I think the shift in that is one for, you know, the ability to gain ground academically within the academy. You know, from what I read, that this was a means of taking advantage of opportunities that are afforded people of color, who oftentimes
affirmative action.
Yes, exactly. You know, and you know, had she made an argument that we're all, you know, just, you know, syncretically, you know, all people of color, then she could make that argument. But that's not what was going on. You know, she is elevating herself in the academy in a way to enable opportunities for herself. Whereas with Rachel Dolezal, I mean, she's working at the NAACP. She is advancing, she is making an argument for pathways and opportunities and accessibility to happen for people of color. You know, so there seems to be a benevolent, you know, element to where she is going within this, you know, not really seeking out anything but to work and do the work in a way that would not, if she had positioned herself as a white woman, that there would always be a sense of suspicion around her commitment to doing this and around her authentic self in doing this. Whereas to pose and pass as Black, no one questioned her authenticity. No one questioned her sincerity. And, you know, so in a way, it sort of moves away, you know, it gets some obstacles out of the way and enables you to do the work. You know, and that's the difference. I just feel like there are, well, you know, if we go back to the late 1990s, you know, that Greg Tate book, Everything But the Burden, you know, there are just things that people want to take when there is something to be taken. But in terms of what one contributes, in terms of what one enables for others, that is generally never, ever cited, you know, and you know, we unfortunately have so many examples of this at the moment, so many opportunistic moments, especially with the Black Lives Matter. So many people who are, you know, whether it's museums, and, you know, I work at a museum, so many statements that have come out aligning oneself. But how does that hold? You know, how does it hold? You know, and where is the benevolency in this, and where is the self-preservation, I will say, that comes with that. It's a bit of a conundrum in terms of now how people are performing even alliances to Blackness, not even Blackness, but alliances with Blackness.
Listen, that is a big one. That is a big one. And, you know, the knocking on doors to ask for how to be different and how to I'm trying to even think of how to phrase it, but, you know, essentially asking Black people to teach how to be human to Black people, as though we've not already had to endure the inhumanity that is thrust onto us. We now have to do the work of teaching white people how to treat us with basic human rights.
Right.
Yeah, it's galling, you know?
Well, it's supremely telling.
Yeah.
How do you debase someone without debasing oneself? How do you deny humanism to people without dehumanizing oneself?
Yeah.
And it has literally, I believe, eroded to such a great place where people really don't understand. They don't really understand how to be human. It's a bizarre concept. It's like, no, you just kind of go about your day and you're just respectful regardless of what someone looks like. You acknowledge their presence. You strip away the macro and the microaggressions. You make a pathway, you know, and oftentimes the way I see it is the way I feel people present it. Is it's either you or it's me. It can't be a coexistence.
Yeah.
It has to be either you or me.
Yeah.
It has
The
to
scarcity
be
model.
either I lift you up but that speaks to the mentality that there is no capacity to coexist. It's either I'm on top or you're on top.
Yeah.
It's not that, we can both just have a level playing field.
Yes.
So this binary that I often get, faced with is, well, does buying Black art or acquiring Black art means that somehow you're not acquiring white art? Well, what kind of sense does that make?
Yeah.
Oh, I get it, because that is the way you see the world.
Yeah.
Because that is what you do. It is not the way other people operate in the world.
Yeah.
And so I think it is genuine. There is a lack of understanding. There is a lack of capacity and awareness as to how to move. It is literally undoing 400 centuries of mentality. And I think it is so ingrained. I mean, now there are a lot of people who are what we call woke, who are walking, and I think that has been a generational thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Subsequent generations have grown up understanding how to do this, but people of our age, people of generations before us, really, it is such a major shift in their thinking and their perception of the world, because that is what they've been taught.
Yeah. Valerie, we have a question. I'm wondering what the two of you think about the recent cancellation of the Guston exhibition, especially in connection to the hooded and anti-Black imagery in Michael Ray Charles's work. It's a great question, Rebecca.
Mm-hmm.
You want
I
to?
think it was a huge mistake.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I totally agree.
I think more than ever. I mean, first of all, I think it speaks to people either not feeling that they have the capacity to do the work or not wanting to do the work, because Guston's biography tells you everything you want to know.
Yeah.
It's very much like what we were talking about with Michael Ray. I'm going to show you these figures. I'm going to reposition them for you. I'm going to show you the absurdity of them.
Yep, the ridiculous.
And allow you to see your complicity in allowing these things to exist in some sort of real way. I think we are living in a time where we need to have those images placed in front of us to see the absurdity of them, to see the fallacy of white supremacy. It is a fallacy. Whiteness is a construction, and we need to sort of unpack all of these things. And that could have been a teachable moment, especially given all of those players involved, the MFAH Houston, MFAH Boston, National Gallery, Tate, London. This could have been a teachable moment. And there you have it.
Yeah. So I absolutely agree. I think it is a huge mistake. I think it's just kind of shows a shortness of thinking, a wrong-mindedness. I think it's also not fully understanding that it's an icon, it's iconography that is well worn. And why not do an art history of the iconography? You know, there's work before Guston and there's work after Guston that is taking the same symbol. I mean, certainly Michael Ray Charles does, Vincent Valdez does, Tammy Rubin does.
And Doyle Hancock is all about it, you know?
Doyle Hancock. I mean, I just showed people this Arnold Kemp in my office. I don't know that.
Paul Rucker. I mean, to unpack what those symbols hold, to rob them of their power, you know, and really utilizing art. Again, artists always thinking ahead, always being, you know, prescient, you know, who have their pulse on the moment. There could have been symposia, there could have been town halls, there could have been a way to allow us to really unpack the grief. And we are grieving as a nation. I honestly feel that way. You cannot go from Obama to him, and I don't even speak his name in this house, to the him. You know, and not understand what that is saying to us as people of color. You can't. And it is the shock and awe of it. Like you would think with the election of the first Black president that we have arrived at least to some joint conclusion, right? Not arrived at success, because there were, you know, more than ever, people of color were being attacked, you know, but we arrived at least collectively as a nation to say we are making room for others. And then for that to have the follow-up to something that says, absolutely, we do not have room for you. We are shutting it down. We are, you know, closing the Pandora's box on every person of color. Don't even think about being gay and being a person of color. Don't, you know, we are reimposing our Christian religious values, which then brings scrutiny to what white Christian practices really are, you know, and where they have been complicit in this mythology of white supremacy, you know, utilizing scripture, weaponizing scripture to debase and demoralize other human beings. You know, so, you know, the fact that we have fallen backwards, we didn't just go backwards, we fell into the muck. You know, I think we are still a bit in shock about this. I think in all of this social unrest is the awakening. Like, okay, all right, we're doing this. Okay, let's see what we can do about this. Our democracy, which has always been fragile, which has always been fraught, is now under attack. And, you know, anarchy is not going to be the answer. It won't be an immediate answer. It ain't the answer now. So I don't know who's listening, but if you don't vote, don't you ever talk to me again. Okay? I mean that from the bottom of my heart, because my life depends on it. Your life depends on it. Generations like my son, your sons, everybody else's children, their lives depend on what we do. So it's not a joke. We're not going to somehow enact anarchy on this country. You are living a lie if you think that is going to happen. We're either going to work with this system and get it to a point where it works for everybody, or we are just going to be living with a dictator. And that's how it is.
Yeah. Valerie, we have one other question that relates to Guston, and it's about the two different censorships. A censorship of Michael Ray Charles's work and a censorship of Guston's work. I guess I It's hard for me to see this as a censorship of Guston's work, though I see why it's being framed as a censorship of Guston's work. I feel like it is a poverty of intellect and courage for these institutions to give the work the time and the energy that it deserves, and that's what it reflects. And I can see how it is censorship because it's trying to stop an exhibition of it. I guess the other reason why I would say that this is not a censorship of Guston, because Guston is so well represented around the world and around the country and outside of the country in collections, and that the work is so highly valued that it's not going to shut down his work. And so in the Charles and Walker example, on the other hand, it was older African-American artists who had not received the attention that they rightly deserved, and that they were reacting against and negatively and protectively, defensively against Charles's and Walker's work. And so it's a pretty big difference in how each of these events is transpiring. Valerie, you want to speak to that?
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right about Guston. I mean, I think what it is denying him a particular platform in this moment and allowing that work to, you know, and I love Kewin. I'm not sure what the thinking was. I would have loved to have been a fly in the room when this was decided. I would have loved to have been on the call when this joint statement was being crafted. You know, there had to be someone in the room saying, what if we're wrong? You know, what is the fear? Is it that museums are already having internal and external forces that are scrutinizing them, that are questioning their every move? Was this the fear that if we put this up, suddenly we're complicit, you know, in elevating Klan thought? You know, I mean, then that's not putting a lot of faith in the work of artists to me. Yeah. That is a failure. You know, art has the capacity to transcend. It has, and museums should be safe places for dangerous ideas to be discussed. We should be about that. So to me, there is a failure in this on the part of these museums. Yeah. But the fact that Guston had a platform to do that during his lifetime is the difference. And I think what happens in terms of, you know, I don't know, we name names, everybody could go and find it. It's, you know, Betty Saar and Howardina Pindell led this charge against Kara Walker, and I love them both. So just, but, you know, I felt in many ways, I'm not sure even to this moment, where it came from, especially given the understanding that artists of their generation also utilized these tropes, that they also took to task these insidious images and turned them on their head and represented them. You know, I don't know whether it was a lack of trust. You know, it is a generational divide. You know, maybe they felt maybe more authentically grounded in their right to utilize these images and weaponize them, and not really having faith in a younger generation to weaponize them in the same way, or to have the capacity to tackle them in the same way. But it never came off as that kind of conversation. Yeah. And that's the sad part about it. It was more or less about a certain commercial success. And, you know, in my mind, it was like, oh, these children are being used. Yeah. And it was like, well, these are grown folks, you know, like, talk to the children. Don't talk to the people, then talk to the children, if that's what you believe, you know? So you know, and I will tell Haludina this, I never signed on to her campaign. I wasn't ever interested. And whenever she called, I said, I'm not signing on to that. That is not our role, you know, to sign on to that, to sign, you know, the Carol Walker, yes, Carol Walker, no. I'm not signing no book. I'm not getting into no book. I'm not getting into this conversation. I believe in the artist's right to create. Now, sometimes what is being created gets ahead of the artist.
Yeah.
And there may not be the immediacy of language to discuss what it is that you intuitively envision and that what you manifest. Sometimes it takes a moment to get the language down. And I think therein was the seeds of distrust, that if you don't have the language for what you're doing, then somehow you are being used, you are ill prepared, and you are doing it for commercial success. I never in my life thought that of Carol Walker or Michael Ray.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I think that there's something to what you're saying about the work in some ways being ahead of what the cultural, what the culture could metabolize, really. And I think that's an important thing to remember. So we have another question. I wonder if there's a fear on the part of the National Gallery of addressing the dark humor of Guston's work, which is also a factor that makes Michael Ray's and Colescott's work difficult. Could you talk about the politics of humor in Michael Ray's work? I mean, I think with all three of them, with Guston, with Colescott, with Michael Ray, that humor is, and abiding humor is really at their core.
Right.
And, you know, I think what's interesting about humor is that on the one hand, it takes people to be in the same cultural group, to have the same shared experiences to get to the joke in the very first place. And so then to, you know, kind of throw that biting, that dark black humor into the mix, you know, it's not going to elicit a laugh. It's more going to elicit a nod, a shake of the head, you know, that, you know, pain, getting at the painful truth. And I think, you know, if you look at the work of someone like Chris Rock, he certainly has that. Dave Chappelle has it. I don't know why I wanted to say La Chappelle.
La Chappelle, that would be fashion. Richard Pryor.
Richard Pryor. Yeah.
Paul Mooney.
Yeah.
Oh my God. You know, Nicodemus. You know, I mean, he. You know what it is that it is a humor, like you said. It is a biting humor which is rooted in an uncomfortable truth.
Yes.
And rather than being kind of uplifting, it has a space of not negativity, but it's sort of that melancholy, I think is a word you even came up with. There is a notion of melancholy and the pessimism that we have to even make light of the things that are literally killing us.
Yeah.
You know, we have to, as Colescott said, we can't let things die. We have to be violent with them. We have to kill them. We have to underscore, you know, on multiple levels, the absurdity of your willingness to debase us. And therein lies something which is truly, deeply disturbing, to make light of the thing that you use to debase us.
Yeah. Absolutely. We have another question that's about respectability and respectability politics. Do we see intergenerational conversations between artists taking place now? I think the easy answer to that is yes, and we can go from there. Is there still a level of Black respectability politics monitoring today?
What does that look like, though? I mean, what if we unpack that? What are they really asking?
Yeah.
I mean, because I could read this notion of respectability as conformativity.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think being respectful means to conform, like suddenly we're all are adopting a sort of standards of engagement or standards of practice, you know, in our work and in our practices.
Yeah.
We again are not monolithic. We've never been monolithic. Your thoughts and the things that carry and interest you are going to be different than the things that interest and carry me. But we're both still in the same river, you know, we're still dipping in the same well. So what does that look like? I mean, I think as you said, yes, there is interracial, oh my God. Yes, we're talking about that too. There is intergenerational dialogue because there are so many artists who are willing to give of themselves in the classroom.
Yeah.
You know, Howardina's been teaching for 40 plus years.
Wow.
You know, Michael Ray is teaching.
Yeah.
People like Dawood Bey are teaching. You know, I think, and what was interesting, because we were celebrating David Driscoll a couple of weeks back,
Yeah.
and it hit me like a ton of bricks, you know, when I think of the legacy of someone like David Driscoll, and that he was in fact groomed by, you know, James Porter and James Porter's wife, Dorothy Porter, that Elaine Locke had a hand, even though he may not have been directly involved. You had people like Sterling Brown. You had a community of people who helped shape one's understanding of the world and one's standing in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, down to like Motown, how they would even teach you how to dress, how to eat, how to walk, how to speak, you know, so that you could move with ease through a very tumultuous and unfamiliar and unfriendly territory, right? And then after David Driscoll, there was Rick Powell, who went through Howard University. You know, there's a whole lineage of people. And then what happens when that disruption comes, when people stop going to historical Black colleges and universities, when people flock to other places where they don't see themselves, where the numbers of faculty are so small and you are so overworked that you can't give these individual students the level of attention and mentorship that they would get if they were someplace else. I mean, there have been ruptures in this. And so when you think about what does it look to be standard bearers, you know, how do we inject and infuse younger generations with a sense of purpose, with a sense of place where they are along this trajectory? That's important. They need to know where they come from, that there is this whole line of people, but it's like true American philosophy. We're in it. We are the first ones. That level of amnesia is off the charts. You know, no one wants to give deference or honor elder generation. It is the wild, wild west. And there is a real danger in that. So how do we not necessarily enact standards upon people, but give them a sense of themselves in the world, so that they know that they're moving with a sense of purpose in the things that they do. That what they do matters.
You know, I think it's interesting that you're saying that. I think that there are kind of locuses of training around the country that are happening. And so if you think about someone like Charles Gaines in SoCal, you think about Daoud and Carrie up in Chicago, and you think about Carrie in upstate New York, and you think about Deb Willis in New York, for example, and Kelly in New York. So there are these, and then Krista and Huey in Chicago, me here in Austin training people. So there are these, you know, kind of well springs of training that are happening. But then at the same time, you know, there's this press that makes it sound as though there's just none of us, that, you know, if there's one Black curator, then it's miraculous, when in fact, we've been here for a long time and people have been here for before you and I were here. And so it has been and continues to be a breeding ground and a professionalizing, to your point. And there are these genealogies of knowledge production. I mean, you know, I just got the new art journal digitally into my inbox, and it's thinking about Douglas Crimp. And, you know, then I remember, okay, there's Jordana Sajese, there's Bridget Cooks, there's Darby, all of them worked with Douglas Crimp. Mm-hmm. And that's not a genealogy that you might put into the larger.
Right. Or when you think of Jeff Hendricks, you know, I mean, on the artistic side, on the creative expressive side, you know, the people who've gone through his work at Rutgers. So we have, you're right, we have different genealogies, and there are, you know, the mainstream or the dominant narrative really does like the shorthand of things, and they flatten things out and they make them two-dimensional, when we all realize that no, it is it's multi-dimensional. And, you know, I guess where I'm coming from when we were thinking about these quote unquote standards, you know, I think there was something about how places like Motown existed, how historical Black colleges existed, and spaces, even where we are today, where I am in the museum. I'm not in a historical Black museum. I'm not in a culturally specific institution, but I am attempting, as you are, as all the other people that you spoke so beautifully about, we are endeavoring in our own way to at least leave something on the table that people can pick up and mentor where we can mentor, and help to, you know, not this Greenbergian kind of mentality, you know. I mean, I am as much a product of, you know, Dr. Floyd Coleman and other people at Howard University as I am of people who were teaching at UT, as I am for, you know, people like, you know, gosh, what is his name? Just totally flew out of my brain, but he'll come back. Maurice Berger, who we just recently lost, or people like Consasha Conwell, you know, or, you know, Patricia Cruz, or, you know, Valerie Mercer, all of these people were pioneers as curators, Howardina Pindell, Kinston McShine, you know, it's the same way. I think we have to say their names in a way that keeps their legacies alive, their memories alive. Otherwise, this subsequent generation really feels that they are emerging out of the vastness of space. And it's like, no, you are part of a long trajectory, and where these genealogies intersect has been phenomenal, because it allows us to be even more expansive in what we bring to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned to you at the start of our conversation that I'm doing an independent study with some students right now, and we talked about some of your exhibitions at CAM, and I have a couple of those books here with me, Radical Presence and Double Consciousness. The rest are downstairs. I'm only just going to show you those couple. But I mean, could you speak to this unearthing of recent history, this making of recent art histories that we have to do, in addition to the work of the historical artists?
Well, you know, I think that's just what I was talking about, this idea that you move through the world with a sense of purpose, you know, and realizing that you're part of this trajectory. And when you really think about, you know, how do we chronicle Black creative expression, that is a fairly nascent construct. You know, I mean, it starts at Howard, it starts with Elaine Locke, it gets codified under Porter, we're talking about in the 1940s.
Yeah.
So we're really not that far removed from the beginnings of building a repository to see ourselves, our creative selves. And so I really believe strongly that there has to be a repository that we're building, you know, and we have to come at this from multiple strategies. It can't, you know, I do shows that are primarily focused on African Americans. I also do shows that integrate cultures, people from different cultural backgrounds together. But you have to focus on those projects in order to tell the story, to build a history. As I said, we're writing history as it happens.
Yeah.
So I'm very mindful about building these repositories. And one of the things that you see, particularly in Houston at the CAM, who has been such an important institution in terms of contemporary art and contemporary art expression. People don't know that the CAM was founded in, you know, the late 1940s. You know, it is a historic institution, but it's also a Kunsthalle, you know, so we don't see that in the collection that they have, but you see it in the scholarship,
Yeah.
in the books that have been written. That is where you get the sense of the history of that place. And one of the things that I notice is that especially Black bodies don't always see themselves as part and parcel of developing the contemporary art landscape. You know, I often, especially in Chicago at the School of the Art Institute, people were not being taught that history. So you come into performance thinking that, you know, I have to give a nod to, you know, Bruce Nauman. I have to give a nod to this person or to that person. And I don't see myself. I am an interloper here. I don't belong here. And I've got to fit and find myself. And I'm like, no, there is a history to Black people working in performance in a very avant-garde way, whether they're coming out of music. And so you cannot talk about contemporary practices and not talk about Neo-Dada. And who is in Neo-Dada? Who is one of the founding members of Neo-Dada? Is Benjamin Patterson. You know, and the people he even collaborated, you know, William Pearson, who was a baritone opera singer who was in Germany creating, you know, experimental music. So, you know, it's all of these histories, not just, you know, I mean, especially Black people I'm interested in, but you could go through each and every, you know, cultural framework and say, yes, there were Latinos in this involvement in this movement and the development of conceptual arco. I mean, you can't even talk about conceptual art without even bringing their language into it. But you didn't see Black people discuss when you talked about contemporary, you know, the nuance of the conceptual in building contemporary practices. So that's where double consciousness came in. It's like, no, there are people who are engaged in this practice, but there were people there at the beginning, people like Charles Gaines, you know, people like David Hammonds. I mean, Adrian Piper is generally the only person who is consistently cited in any kind of text related to conceptual practices. But there were many others, you know, the Singin' and Gooties of the world, the Marin Hassingers of the world. And we have to go back and say, these people were authentically engaged in this practice from the very beginning. And then you can build in and say, these are then the subsequent generations that come along. So that's really where I came from, because contemporary art is generally on the edge of art making, you know, on the edge of that centrality of art expression. You know, we're always putting contemporary art on the edge of something. Well, artists of color are on the edge of that. So to kind of try to bring them and bring them into the central narrative is really what I was attempting to do with those exhibitions.
And such good work. I saw that Jennifer is trying to conclude our discussion. So,
oh, we're just getting started, Jennifer.
Sorry to close things down. I know we're all appreciating being party to your dynamic conversation, but I want us to end on a high note. And so that's why I'm going to stop us now. So thank you so much, Valerie, Cherise. It's really been a pleasure to hear you speak. Cherise's book is out from UT Press, available from your local bookseller. Hopefully we'll all be able to travel in the spring to see the Dirty South at the VMFA. Yes. VMFA, I had it right the first time. Thank you to all our attendees on Zoom and on Facebook. And the Warfield Center is just getting started for 2020-2021. Our next event will launch our Black Women in Politics series, featuring the work of Barbara Jordan, the inimitable Barbara Jordan, on Tuesday, October the 13th at 5 p.m. And then, as I mentioned earlier, our faculty book talks will continue Thursday, October the 15th, 3:30 p.m. with Dr. Lisa B. Thompson, and Thursday, November 12th at 3:30 also with Dr. Samantha Pinto. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening and take care.
Thank you. It was an honor to do this.
Thank you.
Bye, Cherise. Thank you.
Bye, Valerie.